Good day, everyone. We will discuss today Chapter 5, Expenditure Cycle of our Accounting Information System, aptly titled Purchasing to Cash Disbursements. Okay, so we've discussed during our previous meetings that transaction cycles are classified into different types. And the first transaction cycle inside an accounting information system or an accounting process would be the expenditure cycle. Why is it that it's the first thing? It's appropriate that expenditure cycle would be the first thing because when you run a business or you start an organization, you basically spend first before you're given the opportunity to earn money. So expenditure cycle should be the first one because it is the first thing that the business would incur or the first thing that the business would do. Spend something in preparation to the activities leading to leading to revenue generating activities. Now, expenditure cycle, as been defined or has been discussed by several authors, is a recurring set of business activities and related information, processing operations associated with purchase of and payment for goods and services. So basically, as what the title of this chapter appropriately states, it is primarily geared towards purchase. What kind of purchases would that be? It depends on the needs of the entity or the business. If the purchase would require inventory, then basically it would be the purchase of goods or items or merchandise. But if you would be getting services from, say, contractors or from other service providers, then it will be a purchase of service. And obviously, since you are acquiring properties, inventories, merchandise, or you are actually purchasing services from other entities, then you'll definitely have to pay at the end of the cycle. So the end point of the cycle will be the payment for these goods and services. So note that the cycle will start with purchasing and then it will end up with the payment for these goods and services. Note that in an expenditure cycle, majority of which will definitely be internal, since majority of the processing of the information will involve or will include employees directly related to the purchasing process or the expenditure cycle. It would include, say, your accountants, your bookkeepers, even your purchasing agents. These are individuals who would comprise the expenditure cycle. But the primary external party would be the suppliers, because you cannot buy something from your own. Definitely. Well, it may be true to some extent because you may purchase it from, say, related parties or companies or entities that may share owners with your own business. It could be from your other businesses. But bear in mind that in the perspective of running your business, these other businesses, even if they may be related, are still external. Internal would mean your own organization. And therefore, the primary external exchange of information would definitely be with your suppliers. Okay? But within the organization, there would be a need to prepare certain documents that would ensure that there is a flow of information from one department to another to ensure the harmonious running of the expenditure cycle. Okay? These organizational departments may include the actual purchasing department task of preparing the orders and choosing the suppliers. This may include as well the revenue and production cycles, because the different cycles would also provide you with the necessary information, such as the needed inventory to be purchased or the needed finished goods to be manufactured or to be produced. So without this information, you're left with nothing. So definitely this expenditure cycle, the expenditure cycle and its related departments would still need information from different cycles or from different departments. It may also work well with inventory control, Definitely, because purchase of inventory would result to an increase of your inventory. And therefore, working with inventory control and warehouse personnel would only ensure that the balances of the inventories are actually updated based on the actual receipt of these items from the suppliers. Once the goods and materials arrive, notification of the receipt flows back to the sources from the expenditure cycle. Definitely, because you have to provide certain reports, receiving reports or other documents that would um, establish that there was actually a receipt of the items, goods, or services purchased, and they would be communicated to the other party. Okay, so to aid us now with our understanding, we refer now to our context diagram of the expenditure cycle. Note that in the expenditure cycle will receive documents from different departments. From the revenue cycle, the expenditure cycle will receive information with respect to back orders. Ano yung back orders na yan, class? That is actually orders made by the customers that were not delivered kasi wala nang enough inventory level. The inventory available for sale are no longer sufficient. And therefore, the revenue cycle flag now those deficiencies and then send it to the expenditure cycle. If the business is merchandising type, then that back order report will tell the expenditure cycle, bumili ka, buy more in order for us to make good of the deliveries to our customers. But what if the business is a manufacturing concern? That back order will tell the expenditure cycle to buy additional raw materials which will be based on the production cycle. Kasi yung production cycle na yan would tell you naman how many quantities of raw materials are needed in order for them to produce the finished goods. And the finished goods are supposed to be the ones being sold by the revenue cycle. So yung mga raw materials needed na yan from the production cycle may necessarily come from orders made by your customers, and then if kulang or hindi sapat, you send it to the expenditure cycle para ma-inform sila that there is a need to acquire or to procure additional raw materials. Various departments may also provide now information to the expenditure cycle telling them what are the supplies needed. Kasi various departments may not necessarily deliver items to customers kasi hindi naman sila revenue generating. It could be the accounting department, human resources department. But note, class, that these various departments also consume certain office supplies, yung coupon bonds, ink, and other office materials needed in order for them to perform their jobs. Now, if wala na, ubus na, then they would have to inform the purchase requisition or the purchase officer na ito yung mga kulang namin that you have to purchase or to acquire from our suppliers. And therefore, the expenditure cycle will also be what? Informed by the purchase needs or the needs of various departments. And also, the expenditure cycle may also receive information from the inventory control should the company maintain a minimum level of inventory for the period. Kapag bumaba sa minimum level of inventory ang entity, then the inventory control would obviously demand that the items be purchased in order that the minimum quantity be maintained without the need or without waiting for the back order or other information from revenue cycle or production cycle. Kasi sometimes kasi, di ba, kailangan mong bumili because ito yung demand. But without the demand, there's no need to buy. No, because inventory control, sometimes there would be a need to maintain the number of inventories. Yun yung nakaset na efficient, how should I say this, efficient inventory level in order for the entity to effectively respond to the demands later on. So ngayon, pag si expenditure cycle, ay alam na niya yung kakulangan or yung mga needs ng items or goods or services ng entity, the expenditure cycle will then have to prepare the purchase order, which will be then lumped or prepared by vendor or by supplier. And these purchase orders will then be sent to the suppliers. Once approved and both parties agreed, the suppliers will send the goods and services to the expenditure cycle for receiving. Now, the suppliers will then send an invoice representing the amount to be paid by the entity purchasing the services or the goods. And then if na-receive na yung invoice and it's about time to pay it, the expenditure cycle will also be involved in the settlement of these invoices or outstanding liabilities through payments. And when the purchases are done and payments are done, these will be reflected in the general ledger, specifically accounts payable ledger, reflecting now the accounts payable that has been established when an order was made and the goods were delivered, and at the same time, the reduction of accounts payable should payment be made by the entity at the end of the expenditure cycle. So that's how you understand the expenditure cycle in the context diagram, which is basically a top-level view of the entire expenditure cycle and its relationship to the different cycles or different departments of the entity. Now, let's go deeper with the expenditure cycle in a data flow diagram, which will tell you now, inside the expenditure cycle, there are actually 4 activities. First will be the ordering, which refers to the ordering of materials, supplies, and services. And then once orders are made and the suppliers already agreed with you, with the buyer, as to the quantity and as to the amount and the total price of these items being delivered or the services being contracted with, therefore, it will be received now by the entity through the receiving activity. The receiving activity would refer to the merchandise or goods being actually received, or when the supply services are actually performed for the benefit of the company of the buyer. Now, the third activity will be processing the invoice. The invoice is being processed when, after delivery and after they've been accepted, the supplier will send now the buyer, the company, of the invoices representing the deliveries made. The processing of the invoice would require now consolidation or reconciliation using the different documents being prepared by different departments related to expenditure cycle. And lastly, once invoice will be processed already, then the company will prepare cash disbursements voucher that or the disbursement voucher that will lead now to the settlement of the obligation. We call it cash disbursements voucher if the payment is intended to be in cash, or check disbursement voucher if the payment is made through check. Note, class, that the data flow diagram is a more dissected, a more detailed representation as opposed to the context diagram. Here, if you notice from the production cycle, if you notice, you will receive a purchase requisition. The purchase requisition document is usually a document that is prepared by various departments, telling now the purchasing department of the items needed by their department. Ito yung piniprepare based on their historical records, experience, and even rough estimate of the department's needs for the period that has to be supplied by your chosen vendors. Now, the purchase requisition would usually include lang the inventory or items needed to be purchased and the quantity. Wala yan siyang specific supplier because it is the purchasing department's duty to choose which supplier will be picked for these items. So sometimes there would be biddings or canvassing that will be done by the purchasing order to choose now the suppliers for these items or services that would be of highest quality for the lowest cost. That will always be the ideal setup. You will also receive purchase requisition slips from various departments specifically for their office supplies consumption, and a purchase requisition from the inventory control pertaining now to the need to maintain a certain level of inventory that would be deemed sufficient to make good or to comply with the demands as forecasted or as predicted using the sales forecast. Okay? Now, when ordering is done, if you notice, class, if ordering is done, a purchase order will be prepared now by the purchasing department, and this will be sent to the suppliers. Note that the purchasing order is not yet an accounting document, but rather as a mere offer to buy now these items at the equivalent or at the provided quantity. Should the purchase order be received now by the supplier, the purchase order will be the basis now of the delivery. And only until delivery is made, the accounts payable will be prepared, which is now a valid document embodying now the liability of the purchaser or the buyer with represent to the items delivered, and of course, the amount receivable in the perspective of the supplier, which will be demandable now, due and demandable from the buyer. All right? Now, if you notice, class, that the supplier will then prepare goods and packing slip upon delivery or transmittal of the items, goods to the buyer. And these goods are then to be received by the receiving department, and the receiving department will then prepare a receiving report. Usually, the receiving report, class, is a conciliation of the PO that is sent to the receiving department, telling them that these are the items expected to be delivered. Though they will match it with the physical delivery, and the entity may reject now items delivered that are not included in the purchase order. Because note, by essence, class, purchase order is the agreed, authorized, and approved items to be purchased by the entity. Any deviation from that would normally raise a red flag, as there would be some sort of irregularity, diba? So yun yung kailangan ma-raise. Ngayon, kapag na-receiving report na, obviously the inventories will be forwarded to the inventory stores or the warehouses. Ano yung inventory stores, class? Yung mga department store, yung mga grocery. If you notice, class, these are all arranged interior warehouse, because the truth is the department stores and the groceries are actually warehouses na naka-arrange ng properly, allowing people to enter to buy the goods or the properties directly from the shelves, right? So, di ba, kung isipin nyo, rather than stock mong items ngayon somewhere else in a dilapidated building na malayo, why not, display your items or goods in the warehouse? But in that way, make the warehouse now look presentable. And that basically is the start of the groceries or the supermarkets or even the department store concepts. Now, once the delivery has been received, the vendor now or the supplier will then bill the entity or the buyer and will send them the invoice. What will happen now is that the invoice will have to undergo now approval or scrutiny by reconciling now the invoice with the purchase order and the receiving report. If the three documents are regular, meaning walang discrepancy, there is now a presumption that the balance is presented in the invoice is actually regular. Kasi, di ba, dumaan ka ng different departments prepared by different individuals, kung nag-match yan siya, chances are regular yan. Kasi, di ba, you don't think naman that these different departments manned by different individuals will collude with each other to commit fraud. Diba? Ang hirap nun. Kanya-kanyang gawa. Kanya-kanya kayong responsibility. Tapos pag reconcile, nag-match naman, regular. Walang irregularity. Alright? And after the approval of the voucher or the invoice, class, then it will now be forwarded to the cash disbursements department that will write the check or send the bank an information telling the bank to transfer the payment to the supplier's bank account. Note, class, that we've mentioned there of a voucher, which is basically a collection of accounts payable under the header of a single vendor or supplier. It could be kasi that there are several transactions that are subject to be paid under the same supplier, and therefore, if you will pay them one by one, each invoice or not, it would be tiresome. But if you prepare a voucher grouping now your liabilities into the single vendor or supplier, then it's easier because one voucher represents now multiple accounts payables under the name of a single supplier or vendor. Right? Now, let's proceed to the threats and controls and expenditure cycle. Note, class, that we have prepared a table for this. Let me discuss first the general issues throughout the entire expenditure cycle. What are the threats now for the expenditure cycle? The first one will be an inaccurate or invalid master data. This is one serious issue, because when you prepare an accounts information system class and you start using that one with um, a software, for example, you have to enter the master data. Ano yung mga master data na yan? It would involve now the name of your suppliers, the inventories that are expected to be purchased, or inventories expected to be sold. So yun lahat sila class nakalagay dun sa system as master data, meaning hindi sila transactions, but these data or information are required to subsequent transactions, and therefore they have to be registered properly. The threat now, general issue with expenditure cycle, is it could be inaccurate, the master data. Once the master data is inaccurate, it may lead to repercussions, especially for transactions that are reliant on balances with respect to the master data. Say, for example, yung master data mo would include discounts on a certain supplier, na mali yung paglagay mo ng discount, then basically the transactions inside the system would also be wrong. Kasi automatically ipipick niyo yung rate na nakalagay doon sa master data. Another threat would be unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. This is critical, especially for the suppliers, since the suppliers will be faced now with the dilemma of actually sharing personal sensitive information to the buyer, because the buyer would require these information. So the unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information is very parang on top of the threat in an expenditure cycle. Another would be loss or destruction of data and poor performance. How do we remedy these threats? These threats are addressed by creating now integrity controls, having restriction and access to master data, meaning not everyone can access the master data, but a central personnel that is tasked to enroll the master data information, and limiting now access to these particular module. Limiting access now would determine also accountability, kasi kung merong mistake or error in the master data, there's only a single person or a handful of persons who have access to master data that can be held accountable. Now, another would be to review of all changes to master data, meaning a thorough interview on changes made, access controls, encryption, meaning once the access to the accounting information system is not directly made by someone, but rather it is to undergo an encryption process where passwords are to be cracked in order for you to enter. Another will be backup and disaster recovery procedures, because you're relying too much on the system now, like in an accounting information system. But what if merong disaster? If there is a disaster and you may not be able to survive because you didn't provide for backups, that will be a problem. Kasi ang mangyayari niyan is you can no longer reestablish your data information, especially the balances. So another important thing for backup, really, and for disaster recovery procedures, which is now an expensive or a thriving industry, is yung mga IT companies or IT-enabled companies, they maintain certain facilities outside their several regions of the Philippines that are prone to danger or prone to disaster. Once the facilities in the prone disaster areas will be, hit by a disaster, for example, the backup can be recovered from another location. Yan yung another business ngayon ng PLDT, maintaining facilities now where financial information or data of various businesses in the country do maintain their backups in this PLDT facilities, right? And of course, another control will be managerial reports. Now, we have succeeding table their class based on the different activities, the 4 activities under the expenditure cycle, but we will discuss them later on, each after our discussion with these different activities. So let's proceed to the first activity, which is basically ordering materials, supplies, and services. The first major business activity in the expenditure cycle class is ordering your inventory, supplies, or services. Now, in the ordering class, we have 2 steps included. First is to determine what to order, and second will be to select the supplier. Let's go first to the first step, which is determining or identifying the what, the when, and how much to purchase. Now, in determining this one, class, it would require so much time and effort of your personal or purchasing agents, canvassing now, inquiring various suppliers to get the best quality for the lowest cost. The traditional approach to managing inventory is actually to maintain sufficient stock that will allow you to continue your production without interruption, even if such inventory now exceeds way over the expected sale of the period, or if the suppliers or more than the expected sale. Sometimes the inventory being maintained, class, um, are also made in order to avoid now disruption in the business should suppliers fail to make deliveries. However, the modern approach now to identifying the number of quantities, the quality, or the brand of the items to be purchased, and from which suppliers they are to be acquired, are now dictated by several approaches. The traditional approach is what we call the EOQ, or the economic order quantity. This is based on the computation made by the company of the optimal order size to minimum now the ordering cost, carrying cost, and stock out cost. Alright? Pag sinabi natin ordering cost, class, it is related to the cost of purchasing or processing purchase transactions. Kasi hindi naman yan pwede na pag nag-canvas ka lang or you go to different suppliers and convince them to supply you with the products, it won't come free, or it would be straightforward. There will be cost. Yung pag nililigawan mo yung supplier in order for them to give you the contract as their in order for them to supply you what you need, these are all included in your ordering cost. Carrying cost, on the other hand, are those associated with the holding of the inventory. Yung maintenance ng inventory inside your warehouses. Sometimes businesses may not include warehouses or may not own warehouses. So they have to rent out warehouses to hold the inventory. The bigger the inventory you're maintaining, the bigger space you'll need, and the higher the rental expense. But if the computation of the company is super efficient, that has led to basically no over storage of inventory, then therefore there might be no need for you to hire or to rent out massive spaces for your inventories. And that would definitely pose a significant reduction of your cost. Another cost is the stock out cost, which result now from inventory shortages such as lost sales or production delays. Kasi remember, class, in a high speed of fast growing industries, time is of the essence. And any delays resulting from the shortages of your inventory, or even delays with respect to the delivery of your produced items, will result to hefty amounts. And therefore, these amounts may be charged under stock out cost, kasi nga these costs or stock out costs are results of when there is delay or mishap with respect to the computation of the estimated demand for the period, right? Now, another important term that you have to remember, class, under in ordering would be the Materials Requirements Planning, or MRP, which seeks to reduce required inventory levels by improving the accuracy of forecasting techniques to better schedule purchases to justify production needs. Itong MRP na to is basically designed in order for the company to come up with an inventory level that is, deemed to be on an optimal level, efficient level of inventory that does not result to a necessary increase of cost, but at the same time, it efficiently comply with or make good of your demand, of the demand from your customers. However, a modern approach of ordering items is what we call the JIT, or the just-in-time inventory. The just-in-time inventory attempts to minimize, if not totally eliminate, finished goods inventory by purchasing and producing goods only in response to actual sales. Meaning, the delivery, the triggering point of the entity ordering the raw materials needed for production, or what would trigger now the company to order from the suppliers the items needed for the sale, what do you call that one? Para hindi kailangang mag-maintain ng so much inventory, kailangan tamang-tama lang na parang ito yung need natin for the month, ito yung orderin natin, pag na-produce, na-benta siya. However, na JIT or just-in-time inventory, it is imperative that you have reliable line of suppliers that are consistent with providing you with the raw materials needed when you need them. And also, there must be a very short lead time with respect to the production or the acquisition of the inventories needed in relation to the sales or orders made by or orders from the customers. Now, the major difference between MRP and JIT class is that MRP systems schedule production to meet the forecasted sales, thereby creating an optimal quantity of finished goods of inventory. That's why when you go to your financial management, the first budget that you will have to learn to prepare would be the sales budget. The sales budget would include the forecasted sales, and these forecasted sales will determine now how many items are to be produced or how many items to be acquired in order to meet these demands, these orders from your customers, or supposed to be orders from the customers, or estimated sales. The JIT system scheduled production in response to customer demands, thereby virtually eliminating finished goods inventory, but may require carrying sufficient quantities of raw materials in order to quickly adjust production in response to customer demand. Yan yung sinasabi ko na kapag nag-JIT ka, dapat meron kang steady supply of raw materials. Kasi pag nakapag-order ngayon tapos kailangan i-deliver within the month, alam nga namang o-order ka pa ng raw materials dyan. So kakainin niya yung 1 month or kakainin niya yung time period na binigay sa'yo just to comply with the raw mats. Hindi pa included din yung production process itself. So wala rin, di ba? Wala kang magagawa if late ka na masyado. And therefore, it is important for a JIT approach, just-in-time approach, so that there is sufficient or steady supply of inventories or raw materials needed for the how should I say this? For the delivery. Now, both the MRP and JIT can reduce now cost and improve efficiency. Choosing between them depends in part on the type of products and company sell, or what the company sells, right? Now, let's proceed to the second step, which is choosing suppliers. Choosing suppliers now, class, is also a responsibility of your purchasing department, where there is a need to purchase, where the need to purchase has already been identified. You will now have to determine sino yung magiging supplier. Several factors are needed to pick the appropriate supplier. It could be the price, it could be the quality of materials, it could be the dependability in making deliveries. It could also be the lead time of the delivery. Alam nga namang, di ba, your customers are ordering from you, and then you'll still be ordering your supplies or your products to be sold to the customers, and tas darating siya after 6 months, di ba? So that's too lengthy for the lead time. Therefore, you have to include that one as well as a consideration. Once the supplier has been selected for a product, the supplier's identity would become part now of the product's or the product inventory's master record to avoid repeating the supplier selection process. So in an automated system, class, the preferred vendor to a particular item will already be tagged in the item master data. And should there a need now to prepare for a purchase order for these particular items, they may automatically be tagged already under that particular supplier or vendor. So mas madali na ngayon mag-prepare ng purchase order kasi na-automate siya based on historical records or based on na nakatag na preferred vendor or supplier in the item master data. Note, class, that the determination of the order up to the selection of the supplier, if manotice mo, this is the first step. So yung determination of what to order will come from the different various departments na na-discuss natin kanina, and then once determined na yung number, it will be forwarded now to the selection of the supplier, and once the supplier is selected, then we'll proceed now to sending the purchase order to the suppliers. Right? Now, note, class, that the purchase order, as have been mentioned, is the document that formally requests from a supplier to sell and deliver specified products at designated prices. It is also a promise to pay and becomes a contract once the supplier accepts the purchase order. So in the perspective of the company class or the buyer, yung purchase order is a mere offer sent to the supplier. But the moment the supplier agreed with, or the supplier replied based on the purchase order, telling them that ito yung mga presyo namin based on the quantities that you're ordering, and then the buyer agrees with the prices provided by the supplier, then there's already a meeting of the mind. And then the meeting of the mind establishes now a contract between the supplier and the buyer. The VMI naman class, or a vendor managed inventory program, essentially outsources much of the inventory control and purchasing function. Suppliers are given access to sales and inventory data and are authorized to automatically replenish inventory when stocks fall to predetermined reorder points. I remember my former client in a distributor of Unilever Philippines. They have this mandated or required software or application by Unilever where they will use that particular application to record all the deliveries to be made by the distributor. Kasi ang Unilever ang manufacturer, right? And there is a distributor. Ang distributor ang nagde-deliver ng products ng Unilever to various supermarkets, to various sari-sari stores, to various grocery marts across the region 11. Ngayon, pag gumagawa ng delivery si distributor, nire-record nila yan gamit nung prescribed software ni Unilever. So basically, si Unilever mag-access dun sa software at makikita niya yung mga outs ng inventory. So nakikita niya ngayon kung ilang inventory na lang natira or kung gaano ba karaming inventory ang lumalabas per month. And based on that information, Unilever will automatically make the deliveries to the distributor without the need for the distributor to send the purchase order. Kasi nagkukusa na si Unilever based doon sa nakikita niyang inventory reduction kasi nagde-deliver si distributor. So nakita niya, ay medyo in demand ito, marami ang nagpapadeliver, and therefore, by next month, ito na yung i-replenish na a certain level to match the demand based on the software done. With this, nalilimit ngayon yung paper trail and time spent in exchanging various invoices or documents between the buyer and the supplier. Now, let's proceed to the threats with respect to ordering. Ano yung mga threats na yan? Stock outs and excess inventory, purchasing items that are not needed, purchasing at inflated prices, purchasing of goods of inferior quality, unreliable suppliers, purchasing from unauthorized suppliers, and of course, kickbacks made by the purchasing agents from preferred suppliers. Kapag nagpe-prefer sila ng suppliers, obviously, sometimes kahit yung supplier na may not be the highest quality or the cheapest one, pero dahil meron ng friendship si supplier and yung purchasing agent na yan, pipiliin pa rin ng purchasing agent si supplier with the promise na a portion of the sale or a kickback will be given to the purchasing agent. Note class in the controls column, the numbering there refers to the number of threat that they are addressing. Say for example, stock outs and excess inventory. Stock outs pag naubusan ka ng inventory, excess inventory pag sobra-sobra. How do we control the possibility of stock outs and excess inventory? Of course, the adoption of the perpetual inventory system. The perpetual inventory system will automatically give you the balances of your inventory on a regular basis rather than being informed by the balances of your inventory at year-end kasi yun yung periodic. So perpetual kasi, natatrack ngayon yung changes ng inventory on a regular basis, giving you real-time inventory balances. And therefore, makikita mo siya upfront if naubusan ka na ba ng inventory or sobra-sobra yung inventory mo for the period. It may also provide you with a control when you use for barcodes or the periodic physical counts of inventory on a regular basis. The physical counts could be done monthly in order to get the physical count before they move to the next monthly period. Same with purchasing items not needed, yung tatlong 6 na yan, na controls, they will address the problem, especially for items that are unauthorized or wala namang gamit pero na pinabibili pa rin ng certain departments. The address there will be to maintain perpetual inventory system, review the approval procedures and the authority given to purchase requisitions, and of course, centralized purchasing function. Note, class, that you just have to refer to the numbers in order to match the controls that will address these kinds of threats. Now, for example, for kickbacks, and for unreliable suppliers, there will be certain requirements, like say requiring suppliers to possess quality certification and collecting and monitoring supplier delivery performance data. Now let's proceed to the second activity, which is receiving. In receiving, class, there are two steps. First is to receive the goods, and second is to transfer the goods to the inventory stores or your various warehouse or departments. Pag sinabing departments, i-deliver kayo yung mga office supplies that are required by various departments when they prepare the purchase requisition and forwarded to the purchasing department. Note, class, that the receiving department, or the ones receiving the goods, will prepare the receiving report, which is a document that entails or details each delivery, including the date that they were received by the buyer, the shipper, the supplier, and the purchase order number. The receiving report will also provide for the account of the actual items received. If they are sufficient, then everything will be in order. The receiving report's quantity will match that of the purchase order. Kapag hindi naman sufficient, for example, sobra yung na-deliver, the company may reject the deliveries kasi nga ito lang yung nasa purchase order you're over-delivering as. But if kulang naman, then the particular buyer will have to require the supplier to reorder or to deliver again for the deficiency. Or if not, okay na yung kulang, basta i-reduce na natin yung aking invoice kasi nga kulang yung dineliver mo. Alright? Now, in case of damage or poor quality of goods, a document called a debit memo is prepared to reflect now the changes. Ano ito? For example, nakapag-receive ka ng number of items and later on you've discovered that they are faulty or damaged, then there will be a need for you to execute a debit memo that will reduce now the number of items received by the company and then return them to the supplier. In turn, the debit memo will also be the evidence now when preparing for the accounts payable kasi nga, once may return ka, hindi na equal yung items received in the purchase order. So the debit memo is the evidence there of the discrepancy. Kasi nga, di ba, hindi na equal yung purchase order and receiving report kasi nga, na-reject mo yung ilang items na na-deliver kasi faulty or, how should I say this, damaged. Alright? Now, for the threats and controls in expenditure cycle receiving, you notice that there are only 4 threats: accepting unordered items, mistakes in counting, not verifying receipt of services, or theft of inventory. Note in the controls here that these are the things that will have to be implemented to address these threats. Example will be for accepting unordered items. The control there is to require existence of approved purchase order prior to accepting any delivery. So basing now using now the purchase order as guidance when receiving the items, you'll know what items to be expected and how many items are to be expected. So ngayon, kung merong items na sumobra, hindi mo tatanggapin kasi hindi naman siya nakalagay sa purchase order. So the purchase order being authorized and approved ahead or prior basically is the guidance now in the receiving department to accept only what are stated in the purchase order. Alright? You can continue na lang with the different controls with respect to the threats. Now, let's proceed to the third activity, which is approving our supplier invoices. The approval of the supplier invoices class would actually require reconciliation of different documents. Refer now to the diagram in your screens. You'll see there in the traditional 3-way match that in order for the invoice to be approved and to be processed ready for payment by the company, it has to be reconciled based on the 3 documents received. A copy of the purchase order, which is received from the purchasing department, a copy of the receiving report based or received from the receiving department, the ones who actually received the items from the supplier, and third will be the supplier's invoice. Supplier sending us an invoice of the items that were actually delivered and based on their perspective that we owe to pay them. Now, if everything is regular, these 3 documents will have to match, meaning walang difference, walang discrepancy. If there will be discrepancy, it will be a red flag and that has to be reconciled. Kapag may discrepancy sa purchase order and receiving report, the discrepancy could be addressed by the debit memo. And if the debit memo and the receiving report equals the purchase order, then there's no problem. Now, the supplier invoice, should the supplier invoice be bigger than the amount provided in the reconciled receiving report and purchase order, chances are na hindi na-record ng supplier yung return ng items na we deem to be damaged or faulty. So, kailangan mo tawagan sa supplier. Sabihin mo na, you have to resend us a new invoice kasi hindi mo na-reflect itong debit memo na na-prepare namin. So, kung mas maliit naman ang supplier invoice, you have to communicate to the supplier saying that, bakit mas maliit ito? Wala namang ano. And then you'll probably discover na hindi lang nila na-disclose that you're actually, you've qualified for a discount, early discount payment. So, mga ganon. So, those three documents, they have to be reconciled. They have to agree with each other. There's also a two-way approach, which is an evaluated receipt settlement. In this one, is hindi na kailangan ni supplier na mag-send ng copy ng invoice. But rather, ang gagawin na lang ni buyer or ng company is to reconcile the purchase order and the receiving report. And once they've reconciled, you can now prepare the disbursement voucher that will have to be the basis, to pay to the payment made to the supplier. All right? So, note class that in the approval of the supplier invoices, there will be the creation of the voucher package. The voucher package would be the grouping of accounts payables or the payables or liabilities per supplier or vendor. Kasi nga, pag nagbabayad ka, hindi naman siya per accounts payable but per vendor eh. So within that period, if there are standing balances for a particular vendor, gagawan yun siya ng isang voucher. And then the voucher may contain several or multiple accounts payables with a total due and demandable for the period. Note that in a non-voucher system, each approved invoice is posted to individual supplier records in the accounts payable file, and then they are stored as open invoice file that are to be paid. But in a voucher system, a document that has been created as a voucher summarizes now the group of accounts payable group per supplier, and these total balances in the voucher will dictate now how much will be paid to these suppliers or vendors for the period. Right? Now, in an evaluated receipt settlement or ERS, note that this is an invoiceless approach, kaya walang supplier's invoice, but rather the reconciled purchase order and receiving report will be the basis now for the balances to be settled to your particular vendor or supplier, right? Now, in the third activity, approving supplier invoice, we have two threats, which is the error in supplier invoices and mistakes in posting to accounts payable. For the error in supplier invoices, note that to address these kinds of threat, the control will be to create a verification of the invoice accuracy. There will be reviewing process in order to have 4 eyes reviewing the procedure to ensure that the invoice are actually properly served. Another will be requiring detailed receipts for procurement card purchases, or to implement evaluated receipt settlement or ERS, or the restriction of access to supplier master data, and verification of freight bill and use of approved delivery channels. For mistakes in posting of accounts payable, that would be the implementation of data entry, edit controls, and reconciliation of detailed accounts payable records with the general ledger control account. Now, for the fourth activity, this is the cash disbursements. The cash disbursements or check disbursement is the actual payment to be made. Here, the cashier who reports to the treasurer is responsible for paying the suppliers. This segregates the custody function, which is in line with the general principle of internal control, which is segregation of incompatible duties. Therefore, the cashier will have to process the payment, has no access to the actual inventory being delivered by the suppliers. The payment or the disbursement should be performed by the cashier from the authorization and recording functions performed by the purchasing and accounts payable departments respectively. So meaning hiwalay siya from the purchasing departments. Payments are then be made to the accounts payable, sends to the cashier a voucher, a voucher package that will have the total, and then the cashier will prepare the check payments or the cash payments to be sent to these suppliers. Note that many companies now, especially in this digital age, have already started using the electronic fund transfer or EFT and the financial electronic data interchange or FEDI with banks instead of actually writing checks. But there are also still businesses writing checks with respect to settlement of their obligations. Note class in this table, for cash disbursements, we have these threats: failure to take advantage of discounts for prompt payment, paying for items not received, duplicate payments, meaning you've paid twice, theft of cash, meaning nakawang naganap dun sa cashier, check alteration, meaning the amount written in the check were altered by the preparer or someone in the cashiering or treasury department, and cash flow patterns. Note class that in cash disbursements, you have also these controls that will address these kinds of problems. You basically have to read lang these controls. We'll not discuss with them in detail, but these controls are basically designed in order to immediately address the possibility of this threat. If you notice, it's easily understandable naman, it's self-explanatory, that failure to take advantage of discounts for prompt payments, you have to file your invoices by due date for discounts para matrack mo ngayon yung deadlines. And of course, cash flow budgets. Okay? Kasi baka naman kasi deadline na, pero based on your cash flow, you can no longer pay it because you've run out of cash. So there's also have to be an effective cash flow budget in order to ensure that there will be sufficient cash level should the due dates or the payment terms of yours with your suppliers would arrive, so that you can still pay on or before the deadline. All right? So you have to check here in the table. It refers to the different threats. All right? And basically, that's our discussion on expenditure cycle.